I have many fine pens, however none of them seem to give me shading unless I'm using a flex pen for normal handwriting. Do you know why that's the case? I would really like to not have to write super broad because my handwriting is small to get the shading effect. Any suggestions? Well, shading is something that really depends a lot on the volume of ink that you're putting down on the page. And when you're using a finer nib, it's just flat out putting less ink on the page than it is when you use something like a medium broad stub flex, especially flex pens put tons of ink down on the page. So that has a lot to do with it. Ink definitely comes into play. Ink can make a big difference. So let me just talk about all the things that can kind of affect your shading and maybe some things that you can do to adjust it. So there are some pens that have wetter writing fine nibs than others. So even though it's the same tip size, the volume of ink that it puts down has a lot to do with the feed design and the converter, cartridge, whatever design, how that relationship works. You can't really just look at a pen and tell that, but there are pens that have reputations for writing wetter than others. You know, pens like Visconti, Lamy tend to be a little bit wetter than, say, Pilot, Platinum, etc. Generally, the Japanese pens tend to write a little on the drier side than a lot of your European brands do. That's a very broad generalization, but that's often the case. So using flex pens definitely does help. Pens with gold or like a gold-like nib, like a Palladium or titanium, they're usually wetter than steel nibs because steel nibs are very stiff. So when you're writing, especially with any kind of pressure, they're not really going to change much. But when you're writing with a softer nib, the pressure is going to change. It's going to tend to write wetter. So that right there can make a huge difference. Even if you have a nib with a very similar design, such as Lamy, their Lamy steel nibs that they have on the Safari, All-Star, etc., they will write, a pretty decent line. And then if you use the exact same type of nib, like on the Palladium Studio, for example, that has, or a Dialog 3 or something like that, that has a gold nib that looks just like the steel one, but it's gold, it is much softer, much wetter. So that has a lot to do with it. The paper can also make a big difference. So using very ink-resistant paper, that makes a difference no matter what nib size you're using, but especially with fines. If you're using something that's very absorbent, it's going to tend to soak in and flatten out that ink. And if you're using something that isn't putting a lot of ink down to begin with, you're going to have a hard time getting some good shading out of it. And then lesser saturated inks like, Jeroboam, I would say Waterman, Schaefer, some Viscontis, Pelican, a Roshizuku, depending on the color. They usually, inks that are coming from pen makers tend to be less saturated in color than some of the boutique brands like Diamine, Noodler's, Private Reserve. So again, that's a broad generalization. It's not the case for every ink within every brand, but the ink can be a big factor if you're using a less saturated ink, meaning there's less dye content in the ink. You're going to tend to have a better shading because the ink, as it is put into a heavier place, such as when you're writing at the bottom of a curve of a letter, or if you're using a flex when you put with more pressure, where it pools up, it's going to be more concentrated, and in the lighter parts, like at the tops of your letters, it's going to tend to be less saturated in its dye content. So that's basically what shading is right there. And then another thing I would say is don't use permanent inks, because most permanent inks tend to be fairly flat in color, and they also tend to absorb more into the paper and kind of flatten and spread out. Also quick drying inks too. So using those really on any nib, you're not going to get great shading to begin with. So those are just kind of some tips that can maybe help you out.